I am going to tell you what I saw, and I am going to tell it plainly, because the prefect's office has already filed 3 versions of the events that morning in Caliph Station's lower market, and none of those 3 versions are accurate, and I was there, and I am tired of reading lies in official documents and nodding along to them. My name is Dovenseld. I served as a Grade 3 watch officer on Caliph Station for 11 years. I was present in the lower market on the morning of the incident. I am now retired, and I am giving this account to the independent registry at my own initiative, without prompting, because I believe the record should contain at least one accurate version of what happened before the men who ordered it are all dead or reassigned, and the whole thing becomes a footnote that no one can contradict. I want to start not with the morning itself, but with Soren Velk, because you cannot understand the morning unless you understand him first. And understanding him takes a little time, because he is not a complicated man, but he is an easy man to misread if you only look at him for 30 seconds and draw your conclusions. Soren Velk had been, for about 9 years before all of this, the most celebrated arena sport competitor in the Caliph circuit. I watched him compete 3 times when I was young on the station, not because I followed the sport closely, but because it was the kind of thing you went to see once and then found yourself going to see again, simply because of what it felt like to watch him move. He was tall for a human, broad through the shoulders, with a face that always seemed slightly surprised, as though the world kept turning out to be more interesting than he expected. He did not have the bearing of someone who understood their own dominance. He moved like a man who had gotten good at something he genuinely loved, and had not yet worked out that everyone in the building was watching him specifically. He won the circuit championship 4 times. He was, in the language of the sport, technically perfect reaction time, spatial awareness, the ability to read an opponent's body position before the opponent had decided what to do with it. He did not appear to be doing anything unusual. He just appeared to be present in a way that other competitors weren't. His coaches described this quality in different ways in different interviews over the years: awareness, composure, the capacity for stillness under pressure. None of those descriptions quite captured it. What it looked like from the stands was that he was always a beat slower to panic than everyone else, and that one beat was the entire difference between what he did and what other people did. Then his father died. I say this not to use it as an engine. His father's death is not the reason for any of what came later, but because it is when things changed. He stepped away from competition for a year of mourning, which is a human custom his training organization grudgingly honored, and when he came back, something in his timing was fractionally off. Not much. Enough. The circuit is not forgiving of fractional. He lost 2 championship rounds he should have won, and the organization dissolved his contract, and Soren Velk, at 34 years old, was retired from the only professional thing he had ever done. He stayed on Caliph Station. That surprised people. Most competitors from Offworld go back Offworld when the career is done. Soren had come up from a farm settlement in the outer belt at 16 with nothing but a letter of introduction from a regional coach and a bag that was mostly empty, and somewhere along the way the station had become his. He rented a 2-room unit in the lower residential tier, began doing repair work on station equipment. He was competent with his hands, quiet with his presence, unbothered by whatever people thought of the change in his circumstances, and gradually became the sort of person that everyone in a neighborhood knows and no one thinks to mention, because he is simply always there and always agreeable. I would see him on my route maybe 2 or 3 times a week in those first years after the circuit. He did not seek conversation, but he did not avoid it. He would stop for a minute, ask something specific. How was the water filter situation on the East Corridor? Had I heard about the power variance on Tier 3? And then move on. He remembered what you told him. If you mentioned that your sister was unwell and he saw you 2 weeks later, he would ask about your sister. Small things. The kind of small things that are easy to do, and that most people don't do. He was also, by the time I knew him personally rather than from a distance, the keeper of 3 Varath. I should explain the Varath, because there are people reading this who have only heard the name and do not know the animal itself. The Varath are native to the Keth system's second moon. They are, in the most straightforward anatomical terms, large felinoid predators, 4-limbed, digitigrade, with a coat of dense banded fur that shifts color slightly with temperature and mood, running from deep amber gold when calm to a near black when agitated. Adults are built along the lines of a large earth bear, but move like something much more articulated, fluid through tight spaces, eerily quiet for their size, with a face that is too intelligent-looking to be comfortable if you do not know them and are seeing one for the first time. Their eyes are amber wide-set, with vertical pupils that expand in dim light until almost the whole eye is black. They have a low rumble they make when content that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The rumble is not a purr exactly. It is deeper than that, more deliberate, and it carries in a way that a purr does not. When Brackett made it in a closed room, it moved through the furniture. They are not domesticable. That is the official position of every veterinary and xenobiological institution that has studied them. They are not aggressive toward sapient beings without cause, but they are not tameable, not trainable in the conventional sense, not reliably safe in enclosed spaces with species they have not chosen to tolerate. The Hegemony's animal transit protocols classify them at Tier 4, meaning movement of live specimens, requires a multi-department permit, a dedicated handling team, and a security bond posted against potential incident. The xenobiological literature on the Varath uses phrases like apex cognition, social self-determination, and volitional attachment, which are academic ways of saying that the animal decides who it associates with, and there is not much you can do about it either way. Soren's 3 had come to him as cubs, each at different times, over a period of about 3 years. The first was named Brackett. She had been confiscated from a private transport that was moving her illegally across the outer ring. She was 3 months old, the size of a large domestic cat, and in poor condition when the transit authority pulled her from the cargo hold. The transit authority's holding facility was not equipped for her, and they had posted an emergency keeper notice, which Soren had seen on the station board and answered. He had no prior experience with Varath. His application noted this honestly. The transit authority, being understaffed and panicked, gave her to him anyway, along with 2 datasheets of species information that he later told me were largely inaccurate and sometimes actively misleading. I know this history because Soren told it to me himself, over tea, in his unit, the second time I visited him on a neighborhood welfare check. He told it with the particular flatness of a man recounting something he did not think was remarkable, as though answering an emergency keeper call for a critically ill juvenile apex predator was the ordinary thing anyone in his position would have done. He described the first weeks with Brackett in terms that I found difficult to reconcile with what I knew about the species. She was sick, he said, and not eating reliably, and he spent a considerable amount of the first month sitting on the floor of his unit with her, not doing anything in particular, just being there. He had read everything he could find about Varath nutrition and care, and had concluded that most of it was written by people who had never actually been in a room with one. So he had proceeded by paying close attention to what she seemed to want and what she seemed not to want, and adjusting accordingly. What she wanted, it turned out, was for him to be nearby. She would eat reliably when he was in the room and unreliably when he wasn't. She would sleep through the night when he was on the floor near her, not touching her, simply present, and be restless and vocally unhappy when he wasn't. He spent 6 weeks sleeping on his own floor because it was the thing that worked. He described this to me without any complaint or self-congratulation, the way you describe solving a practical problem. She needed this, so he did this. That was the whole story. By the end of the 2nd month, she had recovered. By the end of the 3rd month, she had grown substantially, from cat-sized to something approaching the size of a large canine, and she had begun following him around the unit not because she was unwell, but because she appeared to have concluded that following him around was simply what she did. He had begun calling her Bracket because she appeared in the margin of everything he did, which was his description, and which I thought was accurate. The first time he took her into the lower residential corridor, he told me, the corridor cleared very quickly, which he had expected, and he had held still and waited, and eventually one of his neighbors, an older woman who he had been fixing equipment for over the previous year, had come back around the corner and looked at Bracket and then looked at Soren and said, "Is she all right?" And he had said yes, and she had said, "All right then," and gone back to what she had been doing. He told this as though it was the part of the story he was most proud of, and I understood why. It was the first evidence that the station might be able to accommodate a situation that, by most standards, was completely unworkable. Bracket was, by the time of the incident, approximately 4 years old. She was larger than a draft animal. She weighed, at her last recorded measurement, 412 kilograms. She had a habit of pressing her forehead against Soren's chest when he stood still for too long, apparently as a check that he was still present and adequately warm. He called this her audit. She performed it several times a day. She had also developed, over the years, a specific behavior when she sensed that Soren was tired or under stress, which was to position herself against his left side and lean very slightly, not enough to move him, just enough so that he could feel her weight there. He had told me he thought she did this because she had noticed, at some point in the early months, that physical contact was something he found calming, and that she had filed this away the same way she filed away everything else that mattered. The second Varath was named Stillwater, named by Soren for reasons he described to me, as the cub had been very still when they found him, and very loud once the Stillwater ended, which I took to be a human joke of some kind. Stillwater had been found in the service corridor behind the station's secondary docking ring by a maintenance crew that had called security, and security had called me, and I had called Soren because at that point he was already known on the station as the person with the Varath, and I did not know what else to do. Stillwater was approximately 2 months old, clearly separated from any adult, and in a state that the maintenance crew described as scary quiet. He had positioned himself in a corner of the service corridor with his back to the wall, and was watching the maintenance crew with a patience that they found more alarming than aggression would have been. Soren arrived with a carry pack and a container of the hydration fluid he used for Bracket, and a portion of the food he prepared for her, which he carried in a cloth bag, and he crouched in the corridor, set all of it on the floor in front of him, and waited. He did not advance towards Stillwater. He did not make sounds. He sat in the middle of the corridor at roughly Stillwater's eye level and was present, which was, I had come to understand, the specific thing Soren did that other people didn't. He was simply present, without wanting anything from the situation, without radiating the particular tension that sapient beings produce when they are afraid or when they want something very much. It took about 40 minutes. Then Stillwater ate and allowed Soren to touch him, first on the shoulder and then, gradually, on the face, and Soren sat with him in the corridor for another hour before he gathered the equipment and the cub and walked back to his unit. I followed at a distance, because it was technically my patrol area and technically my responsibility, and also because I wanted to see what happened. What happened was that Bracket came to the door when she heard them and smelled the cub, and there was a period of perhaps 5 minutes during which I held my position in the corridor outside and did not breathe very deeply, and then there was the sound of the rumble. Both of them, 2 registers, Bracket's lower and Stillwater's still too young to have his full depth, and then silence, and then Soren opened the door and said I could come in if I wanted. Stillwater was asleep against Bracket's side. He was perhaps a third of her size. Bracket was looking at the door with the steady amber attention she gave to everything, and when I came in she looked at me and then looked back at Stillwater and rumbled once, very briefly, which Soren later told me he interpreted as an acknowledgement that I was acceptable to be in proximity to the cub. I do not know if this interpretation is correct. I know that she did not move and that the cub slept. Stillwater was, at the time of the incident, 3.5 years old. He weighed slightly less than Brackett, 390 kilograms, but he was taller at the shoulder, and he had the habit of lying across doorways when he was relaxed, which made navigating Soren's unit something of a negotiation. He was the quietest of the three. He could be in a room with you, and you would not know it for several minutes, which was an unsettling quality in an animal of his size. He had a specific habit with Soren of waiting for him in whatever room Soren was about to enter rather than in the room Soren had just left, which implied an understanding of Soren's routine that I found difficult to fully think about. The third was named Kale. She was the youngest, 2.5 years old, and the largest, already heavier than the other two at 360 kilograms and still visibly growing. She had come through the station's animal welfare office when a private owner on the upper residential tier had applied to surrender a Varath cub they had acquired illegally and then discovered they could not manage. The welfare office had contacted Soren before they contacted anyone else, which told you something about how the station had come to think of him in relation to the Varath. Kale had apparently arrived at Soren's unit already fully convinced that it was hers, and had spent her first day there systematically investigating every surface and establishing which parts of the floor and furniture were acceptable places to sleep and which were not. Soren had spent the same day following her and correcting her conclusions about the furniture, with what he described to me as mixed results. Kale was the most outwardly expressive of the three. Brackett communicated primarily through positioning and pressure, where she stood, what she leaned against, the angle of her attention. Stillwater communicated through what he did not do as much as what he did. Kale communicated through sound, not vocalization exactly, but a complex system of rumbles and sub-rumbles at different pitches that Soren had learned over her first year with him to distinguish from one another. He could not, he told me, explain what each variation meant in language that would be useful to anyone else. He knew what they meant in context, the way you know the meaning of a familiar expression on a familiar face, without being able to define the individual muscle movements that produce it. All three had free range of his unit when he was home. When he went out, two of them typically stayed. Brackett almost always came with him, since she had, somewhere in the first year, adopted the position that she and Soren went together, and that was simply the structure of the world. The station's lower market was used to them. It had taken a while. There had been a period, when Brackett first began accompanying Soren into public spaces, of considerable alarm, evacuations, security alerts, one incident with a cargo lifter that I would rather not describe in detail. But Soren was patient and consistent, and he knew everyone in the lower market by name. And eventually the market arrived at a sort of working peace with the presence of a 400-kilogram felinoid predator moving calmly among the stalls on a route that was, admittedly, fairly predictable. Brackett liked the bread vendor near the east entrance, not to eat the bread, which she did not eat, but because the vendor had at some point given her a corner of flatbread as a gesture of uncertain intent, and Brackett had accepted it with grave seriousness, and had apparently catalogued the location as a place that acknowledged her. She visited it on most mornings. The vendor, Soren, had come to accept this as a feature of her morning routine, with the philosophical equanimity of someone who has decided that certain things are outside their capacity to change and are not worth fighting. This is the context. This is who Soren Velk was and what he had and where he was in his life when the Hegemony trade delegation arrived on Calith Station for what the prefect's office described as a routine negotiation visit. The delegation was led by a subprefect general named Orvan Satach, who was young for his rank and had the manner of a man who understood power primarily as the enforcement of visible hierarchy. The kind of man who looks at something that does not fit the hierarchy he expects and reacts to it as a personal challenge. He had come up through the Hegemony's administrative track rather than through any military or field service, which meant he had spent his entire career in environments where formal authority was the primary mechanism of everything, and where the distance between what you were on paper and how you were treated in practice was very small. He had, I suspect, rarely been in a situation where that gap was large, where the paper said one thing and the room said something quite different. He was not prepared for Caliph Station's lower market, which was a room that said quite different things from what any paper about it said. He had been on the station for 4 days before the incident. He had already, in those 4 days, made 2 formal complaints about the animal management protocol on the station's residential tiers, which complaints were directed at Caliph Station's prefect, and were very specifically about the presence of unregistered Tier 4 animals in mixed civilian space. He was not entirely wrong, legally. Soren had permits for the Varath. He had spent considerable time and money acquiring them, working with the station regulatory office over a period of about 18 months to establish a variance that satisfied the station's own charter requirements, even if it did not map precisely to the Hegemony's multi-department certification process. The difference was bureaucratic rather than substantive, but bureaucratic distinctions matter enormously to a certain kind of official, and Subprefect General Sadhach was that kind of official. He sent his station liaison to Soren twice, in the days before the incident, with formal notices that the Varath needed to be surrendered to the delegation's designated animal handling unit pending review of their permit status. Soren read both notices, was polite to both liaisons, and declined both times on the grounds that the station-level variance was valid, and he would be glad to address any concerns through the station's own regulatory process. He said this without apparent agitation. He said it the way a man says something he has considered and decided is correct and sees no reason to shout about. I heard about both of these interactions secondhand, from colleagues who had been nearby, and what I heard was that Soren had been straightforward and polite and completely immovable in a way that was, apparently, more difficult to respond to than anger would have been. Anger gives you something to work against. Soren's manner gave you nothing to work against. He agreed that the liaison had a job to do, and he agreed that the liaison was doing it properly, and he remained unable to comply with the order on the grounds that he believed the order was based on an incorrect reading of his permit status. He offered, both times, to meet with the relevant regulatory officer at any convenient time to discuss it. Both liaisons had apparently left these conversations slightly confused about what had gone wrong. On the 3rd day, Sadhach sent station security rather than a liaison. I was not part of the detail that went to his unit. I want to be clear about that. I was assigned to the lower market that morning on routine patrol. I heard the detail go out on the comm channel, and I heard that Soren had again declined, and that there had been a conversation that the detail described as non-compliant, and I heard the detail return without the animals. And then about 40 minutes later, I watched Soren come into the lower market with Brackett walking at his left side, and Stillwater and Kale moving behind him. This was unusual. He rarely brought all 3 out together. He brought 1 or 2, typically Brackett almost always, and one of the others when the day called for it. By some calculation I had never worked out. All 3 was something he reserved for occasions when he felt, I think, that they should be together and that the outside world was the right context for them to be in. I thought, watching them come through the east entrance, that he had brought all 3 because he did not want to leave the other 2 in the unit if security was going to come back, and he did not want to leave Brackett alone either, and he had decided that the lower market, familiar ground, people who knew them, Sath Oren's stall and the bread vendor's corner, was the right place to wait out whatever was going to happen next. He was not making a statement. He was not daring anyone. He was a man who was worried about his animals and had decided that the safest thing was to have them with him. I know this because I know Soren, and because the expression on his face when he came into the market was not defiant. It was tired and mildly unhappy, the expression of a man dealing with a problem he did not cause and cannot entirely understand, and is trying to handle with the same patience he brings to everything else. He went to Sath Oren's stall. He bought bread. He broke a corner off and held it down for Brackett, who took it with the same grave deliberateness she always brought to the transaction. He leaned against the stall's edge and drank the small cup of grain drink that Soren handed him without being asked, which was something she did on mornings when he looked like he needed it. The detail came into the market approximately 20 minutes after he did. There were 6 of them, station security uniforms, but I saw Sadach's personal aide at the back of the group, which told me this was not a routine call. The detail's lead was a man named Vesk, who I knew slightly, who was not a bad man but was the kind of man who follows orders without examining them closely enough in advance, and then has to work out what to do with the consequences in real time. He had, I could see as they crossed the market, not fully thought through what 6 people with equipment were going to do about 3 Varath that weighed a combined total of over 1,000 kilograms and had not been asked to go anywhere. They approached Soren at the bread vendor's stall. Vesk told him that the animals were being confiscated pending permit review and that this was a formal order under Hegemony Animal Management Protocol, which superseded the station variants. He spoke loudly, the way people speak when they want bystanders to understand that authority is being properly exercised. The market had gone quiet. People had moved back. Not far, the stalls were close together, and there were a lot of people, but back. The kind of back that means, I am not involved in this, but I am watching. Soren said, quietly, that he understood the claim Vesk was making, and that he continued to dispute it on the grounds that the station variance was valid, and that he was happy to accompany Vesk to the regulatory office and discuss it there, but that he was not going to hand the Varath to anyone on the basis of a verbal order from a delegation that did not have station jurisdiction. He said this without raising his voice. He kept one hand on Brackett's shoulder. She had moved slightly forward when the detail approached, not aggressively, but she had positioned herself between Soren and the detail, the way she positioned herself when she judged that the space between him and something else needed to be smaller. He had put his hand on her shoulder and she had held still. Stillwater and Kale were behind him and to either side close. Their ears were forward. They were watching the detail with the specific attentiveness that Varath give to things they are assessing. They were very still. Vesk said the order was not open to dispute. Soren said he understood that was Vesk's position, and he maintained his own. And then Sadach's aide stepped forward and said something that I have thought about many times since, because it was the specific thing that caused everything that followed, and it was an extraordinarily stupid thing to say. He said, "You have 10 seconds to move the animals or the detail will move you." Soren looked at him for a moment, then he looked at Vesk. Then he looked back at the aide. He said, "I would ask you not to do that." He said it the way you might say it to someone who was about to put their hand on a hot surface. Not a command, not a threat. A quiet, genuine, measured warning from a man who was telling you precisely what was true. The aide, who was young and angry and standing in front of an audience, took one step forward and put his hand on Soren's arm. I have tried to describe what happened next accurately in every account I have given, and I am going to try again here. Brackett moved first. She did not lunge. She did not make a sound. She turned very smoothly and put herself between Soren and the aide stumbled backward because she was there, and she was very large and she had not been there a moment before, and the speed of it was not something his nervous system had been prepared for. He sat down on the market floor. He was not hurt. He had been moved out of contact with Soren by a 400-kilogram felinoid predator who had simply relocated herself with the speed and precision of something that does this effortlessly. And he was sitting on the floor because his legs had stopped cooperating with the rest of him. The detail's reaction was to raise their equipment. 3 of them raised restraint poles, long-handled electric tip, the kind used for large animal management in transit facilities. 2 raised sidearms. Vesk, to his credit, did not raise anything. He stood very still, which I thought was the most intelligent thing anyone in his position could do. Stillwater and Kale moved to either side of Soren, not behind him, to either side slightly forward so that he was between them and behind the line they created. The three of them formed a shape bracket in front, Stillwater left, Kale right, and they held that shape without a sound, without moving, with their eyes on the detail, and the detail did not advance. The people behind the stalls in the surrounding area did not move either. There was the kind of silence that a large enclosed space produces when everyone in it has stopped breathing at the same moment. I was about 20 meters away. I did not advance either. Soren stood between them with his hands at his sides, and he looked at Vesk, and he said, in a voice that was perfectly level, "I am going to ask the detail to stand down and leave the market. I would like to go home. I would like to take my animals with me. I am still happy to discuss the permit question with the regulatory office at any time." Vesk said nothing. I could see that he was calculating something, the math of what he had been sent to do versus the math of what was directly in front of him, and the math of what he was going to write in his report afterward, and how he was going to explain this to two different chains of command. It was a complicated calculation. I did not envy him. The aide, still on the floor, was fumbling for his comm. One of the detail members with a restraint pole took one step forward. Kale turned her head, just her head. She looked at the man with the pole, and the man stopped walking. I was 20 meters away, and I saw the exact moment when his body made a decision that his mind had not quite caught up to yet. The step arrested midway transfer, the forward lean correcting back to neutral. He put the pole down. He stepped back. He did not pick the pole up again. Sadach arrived in the market about 4 minutes after all of this. His aide had reached him on the comm. He came with 2 more detail members, and with the manner of a man who had decided that the situation was an affront to him personally, and was going to resolve it with the weight of his rank and the certainty of his authority, because those were the tools that had always worked before, and he had no reason to believe they would not work now. He walked through the market. People moved for him. They always do for a man walking fast in a hegemony uniform with that specific kind of certainty. And he stopped at the edge of the space the Varath had created. Brackett looked at him. She looked at him for approximately 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds I watched Sadach's certainty interact with the reality of what he was looking at, and I watched the result of that interaction in his face, which was not fear exactly. He was not a coward, I will give him that, but was something close to the expression of a man who has opened a door expecting one room and found a much larger one. He held his position. He looked at Brackett and then at Soren and said, in a voice that was very controlled, the voice of a man who was working to maintain something, "This ends now. The animals go with my handling unit or they are destroyed where they stand." Soren looked at him. He looked at him for a long moment, the same slightly surprised expression he always had, as though the world had once again turned out to be more unusual than he had anticipated. He said, "I heard you." And then he reached forward with one hand and rested it on Brackett's neck, just behind her left ear, and he said to her quietly, "I had moved forward during Sadach's entrance, and I was close enough now to hear him," he said. "Easy, easy, I've got you." Brackett made the sound. The low rumble, the one that goes into your chest and into your spine and into the chair you're sitting on, and when she made it in the open market, it moved through the stall frames and along the floor, and every person within 20 meters felt it in their feet. She did not move. She did not take her eyes off Sadach. Soren looked at Sadach again and said, "I'm going to walk home now. My animals are going to walk home with me. If you need to discuss the permit status, the station regulatory office is on level 4. Sadach said, "You are not walking anywhere." And he gestured to his detail. 2 of them moved forward. What happened in the next several seconds has been described in the official report as a security incident involving non-compliant animals. I want to describe it more accurately than that. Brackett stepped sideways, toward the closer of the two detail members and placed her left forepaw, which was approximately the size of a dinner plate, on the man's foot, just on his foot. She did not press down with any apparent force. She did not look at him. She looked at Sadach. The man stopped moving, because there was 400 kilograms of Varath standing with one paw resting on his foot, and there was nothing in his training, in any training document he had ever read, in any professional experience he had accumulated, that had prepared him for what to do next. Stillwater lay down. I know this sounds less alarming than what was happening to the other detail member. But Stillwater lay down directly in front of Sadach. 390 kilograms of him stretched across the path between Sadach and Soren, and he put his head on the floor and looked up at Sadach with his wide amber eyes, and he rumbled that chest-deep sound in its lower register. And Sadach stopped walking, because there was nowhere to walk to that did not involve stepping over or onto an enormous felinoid predator that was watching him from the floor with patient and specific attention. And neither of those options presented themselves as viable. Kale, in this same window of seconds, turned to face the two detail members who had raised sidearms and had not yet lowered them. She looked at them with the direct amber attention that Varath give to things they are assessing. Then she yawned. The yawn of a Varath is not a comfortable thing to witness. It is a large animal opening a jaw wider than most people's shoulder span and displaying teeth that are not decorative in any functional sense, and the yawn is slow and deliberate and lasts several full seconds, and when it closes, the animal continues looking at you with the calm, patient attention of something that has already worked out the relevant arithmetic and found the answer straightforward. Both of those detail members lowered their sidearms. Sadach was standing in the market square of Calith Station with 1,000 kilograms of apex predator distributed between himself and the man he had come to move, and he was unable to go forward and unwilling to show that he was unable to go forward, which produced a stillness in him that lasted, by my count, approximately 40 seconds. In those 40 seconds the market was entirely quiet. I could hear the atmospheric circulation running in the ceiling ducts. I could hear the aide on the floor behind the detail breathing, in a way that suggested he was having some difficulty. Sadach said, "This is not over." Soren said, "I know, I'll be at the regulatory office at 9th hour if that's useful." But he walked home. He moved toward Brackett and she fell into step at his left side, and Stillwater rose unhurried, as though getting up from the floor was something he was doing for his own reasons rather than because the situation had resolved, and moved to Soren's right, and Kale came behind and they walked through the market. The stalls were still quiet. Every person in the market was watching. They walked through the east entrance. The bread vendor, I noticed, had set out a piece of flatbread on the corner of the stall as they passed. Brackett took it without breaking stride. That was the morning of the incident. Now I am going to tell you what happened after, because the morning is not the part that matters most, though people tend to stop the story there. The morning is the part that was visible. What happened after was quieter and in some ways considerably more important. Sadach filed his incident report that afternoon. It characterized the Varath as dangerous and non-compliant animals, and Soren as obstructing a lawful hegemony order, and it requested that the station prefect authorize a formal confiscation action with sufficient force to execute it. The station prefect, a woman named Caldera Yeth, read the report and sent a reply that was, by bureaucratic standards, notably brief. She noted that the station-level variance for the Varath was valid under Calith Station's own charter, that the Hegemony's animal management protocol did not supersede station charter in civilian residential zones absent a declaration of emergency, and that she would not be authorizing a confiscation action. She also noted, in a final line that I have heard quoted several times since, that she had reviewed the market security footage, and that, in her assessment, the Varath had demonstrated exceptional restraint under provocation. Exceptional restraint. I have thought about that phrase. It is accurate. It is the most accurate description in official language of what happened, and it is also somewhat remarkable that an official document said it. Sadach filed a complaint against Yeth with the Hegemony's Regional Oversight Office. The Oversight Office acknowledged receipt and assigned it a review queue. I am told the review queue for that office is approximately 14 months long. He also attempted, over the following 2 days, to escalate through 3 separate Hegemony channels to obtain an emergency animal removal order that would supersede station authority. 2 of the 3 channels declined to proceed on the grounds that no actual harm had occurred. The 3rd channel requested additional documentation. The documentation was filed. The documentation review is, as far as I am aware, still pending. On the 3rd day after the market incident, Sadach's delegation concluded its trade negotiation and departed Caliph Station. The negotiations had not gone well for them, which I do not think was a coincidence, because Prefect Yeth is a capable woman and the kind of capable woman who does not forget what happens in her market square. Soren went to the regulatory office at 9th hour on the morning after the incident, as he had said he would. He brought his permit documentation, organized in a folder, which his neighbor, the older woman who had come back around the corridor that first time, had helped him prepare the night before, apparently at his kitchen table while Brackett sat on the floor nearby and audited proceedings. The regulatory officer, a man I know slightly named Besek, reviewed the documentation and confirmed that the station-level variance was in order and that no further action was required on Soren's part. Besek has told me since that the meeting took approximately 20 minutes and that Soren thanked him and offered to bring tea the next time, which offer Besek found unusual but genuine, and that he has been mildly hoping Soren does bring tea, because the tea in the regulatory office is not good. Brackett waited in the corridor outside the regulatory office during the meeting. Besek has told me that she was present against the wall of the corridor when he arrived in the morning, and that she remained in the same position, entirely still, for the duration of the meeting, and for approximately 10 minutes after Soren had collected his documentation and left. Besek found this more alarming in retrospect than the meeting itself. On the evening of the market incident, I went to Soren's unit. Not officially, I was off shift. I went because I had watched the whole thing and I was unsettled, and I suppose I wanted to make sure he was all right, and I was also, if I am honest, still processing what I had seen the Varath do, and needed to look at them in a calm context to remember that they were, in ordinary circumstances, simply large animals that Soren lived with and had raised from juveniles. He let me in. He made tea. Brackett was on the floor taking up approximately 1/3 of the available space. Stillwater was in the doorway to the second room, which is the doorway he preferred. Kale was somewhere that I could not initially locate, which produced a particular discomfort that lasted until Soren said she was on the roof terrace, and that she often slept out there when the atmospheric circulation was running well. I sat down and drank tea and looked at the 3 of them, 2 of them, with Kale on the terrace, and Brackett looked back at me. She had looked at me before, many times in this unit, and it never became entirely comfortable at that scale and in that direct way, but she knew me from the neighborhood and she tolerated me without tension, which I had come to understand was as good as it got. I said he had warned them. He said he had. I said, what would have happened if Sadach had pressed further, if one of the detail members had done something more than step forward? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Brackett. He looked back at me. He said, I honestly don't know, and I mean that. I don't give them orders. I've never had to, and I'm not sure I could in that way, not orders they would follow because I told them to. They do what they do. I try to be worth what they do. I said, that is not a comfortable answer. He said, no, but it's an honest one. We were quiet for a while. Brackett rumbled. It went through the chair and into my spine, and I had the involuntary thought that I was sitting in a room with 3 animals, 1 on the terrace, 2 in here, that were each heavier than any vehicle I had ever operated, and that they were choosing to rumble rather than to do anything else, and that the only reason they were making that choice was the presence of this mild, tired man drinking tea across from me. I said, does it worry you that they do what they do and you can't control it? He thought about this longer than I expected him to. He looked at Brackett. He reached forward and rested his hand on her head, between her ears, the way he always did, and she pressed into it the way she always did, that enormous head moving toward his hand as though it was the center of a gravity she was subject to. He said, what worries me is what almost happened to them. They were going to take them, or worse. And that worries me because they chose me. They didn't have to. I was nobody to any of them when they showed up. I was just present, available, and then I was there consistently, and they decided I was part of whatever they were, and I do not take that lightly. I take it more seriously than anything I have ever done in my life, including the championship. He looked up at me. He said, the winning didn't worry me. The competition never worried me, even when I was losing. What worried me, every single time, was whether I was going to be adequate to what the day required, whether I was going to be worth what the people watching me had given up their evening for. He looked at Brackett again. He said, it's the same thing, I think, just the stakes are different. I want to tell you about Soren, the bread vendor, because I think it is important, and I think it belongs in this account. She had been at her stall the entire time during the incident. She had not moved. She had not been evacuated with the other vendors who had enough distance to step back. I asked her about this afterward, and she said she hadn't felt the need. I asked her when she had started giving Brackett the corner of flatbread. She said, the first time the big one came through with him about a year ago. She put her nose on the edge of my counter. She didn't take anything. She just looked at what was there, and I couldn't tell if she was curious or if she was deciding something. I broke off a corner and put it in my hand. I held it out. She looked at me for a while. That takes some getting used to, that look, and then she took it very carefully, and that was that. She comes every morning now. I have a corner ready. I asked her if she had been frightened that first time. She said, not of her. I have been frightened, from the first time I saw them with him, of what some frightened person or some official person would eventually do to them. That has worried me from the beginning. She paused for a moment. She said, Soren came to the stall the morning after all of it. He thanked me for the bread, the way he always does, and I asked him how he was. He said he was all right. He looked tired, and he looked like a man who had spent the night not sleeping particularly well and was not going to mention it. I told him I'd been watching the whole thing and that I thought he had handled it well, and he smiled. He smiles with his whole face, that man. There is nothing held back about it, and he said he hadn't done anything, really. The girls had handled it. She looked at me. She said, he meant it. He genuinely believed he hadn't done anything. Those animals of his are 400 kilograms each, and they put themselves between him and harm, and held that position without a sound or a wrong move, and he thought he hadn't done anything because he hadn't raised his voice. She went back to arranging the bread on her counter. She said, I think that's who he is. I don't think he knows what he is to them. I've watched them with him for a year, and I'm not sure he knows. I have thought about that since. I have thought about it in the context of watching Soren in the market on ordinary mornings, buying eggs from the Eastern vendor, talking to the water filter repairman about a part he'd sourced, stopping when someone stopped him to talk, which happened often because he was easy to talk to and because people on the station had come, gradually, to feel that he was one of theirs. Brackett moving at his side. The other two when he brought them. I have thought about what it means that 3 animals, each of them capable of clearing the lower market in under a minute if they chose to, have decided that their primary concern is staying close to a man who fixes station equipment and buys flatbread. I do not think they made an error in their assessment of him. I watched him compete 3 times years ago. I told you that. What I did not tell you is what I remember specifically from the 3rd time, because it is relevant. It was the final round of the circuit championship, his last one, as it turned out. He was in the arena against an opponent who was technically inferior but who had prepared specifically to disrupt Soren's rhythm, to get inside the timing that made Soren exceptional and make it unreliable. For the first third of the round it was working. Soren was fractionally off. The crowd was quiet in the way crowds get when they are watching something go wrong that they did not come to see go wrong. And then something changed. I have thought about how to describe it, and I have not found a better description than this. Soren stopped. Not literally, he did not break stride, but there was a moment, visible from the stands, where he seemed to become very still inside the motion, the way still water is still in a room, present without demanding to be noticed. And then his timing came back. Not because he forced it, because he stopped compensating for the disruption and returned to what he actually was. He won the round. He won the championship. Afterward, in the press session, someone asked him what he had done in that middle section when it looked like things were going wrong. He said, "I stopped thinking about what was going wrong, and I thought about what I was doing instead." That is a simple answer. It sounds like nothing until you have been in a situation where doing it is genuinely difficult, and then it sounds like the most useful thing anyone has ever said. I think the Varath know this about him. Not with language, not with anything that resembles the kind of reasoning that produces language, but with the attention they pay to things that are true. He is the kind of person who, when something very large and frightening enters his space, does not run and does not perform dominance, but simply remains present and pays attention, and the thing that was large and frightening looks at him and makes a different calculation than it makes about everyone else. He is not brave, in the sense of overcoming fear. He is something slightly different. He is not organized around fear the way most people are, and predators, the kind that have been reading the truth of other creatures since long before they had language to describe what they were reading, noticed this immediately. Subprefect General Satach was reassigned to the Outer Transit Administration 8 months after the incident. The reassignment was described as routine. I have not heard his name in connection with Caliph Station since. Soren still lives in the lower residential tier. He still does repair work. He still comes to the lower market most mornings, Brackett at his left side, the other two on mornings when everyone wants to be out. Brackett still takes the corner of flatbread. Stillwater still lies in doorways. Kale is still growing. I want to end with something that happened about 3 months after the incident, because I think it is the truest picture of what Soren is and what the Varath are with him. He came to the market on an ordinary morning, Brackett with him. He stopped at Sath Oren's stall as he always does. He bought bread. There was a child, a small one, perhaps 4 or 5 standard years old, a species I do not know the name of, the kind of child that age who has not yet been taught to be afraid of things that are large. The child had gotten ahead of their parents somewhere in the crowd, and was standing in front of Brackett with an expression of pure and uncomplicated interest, the way children look at things before they learn to interpret the reactions of the adults around them as a guide to how to feel. The parent came around the stall, saw where the child was, and produced the sound that parents produce when they locate their child in proximity to something that could eat them without particular effort. Brackett looked at the child. The child looked up at Brackett, then reached out and put one small hand on Brackett's nose. Brackett was very still. Then she made the low rumble, the sound that goes into your chest. The child laughed. Children, apparently, experience the chest rumble as funny rather than alarming. This is perhaps something worth considering about children. Soren looked at the parent who had frozen and said, quietly, without any performance about it, "She's all right. She's very good with people she doesn't feel threatened by." The parent managed to produce some syllables. Brackett pressed her nose forward, very gently, into the child's hand. The child laughed again. And then the parent gathered the child and walked quickly in another direction, and Brackett watched them go, and then looked up at Soren, and he reached down and rested his hand between her ears, and she pressed into it, And they stood there for a moment in the morning market while Sath Oren did not look at them and arranged bread with particular attention. That is what I saw. That is what Soren is. That is what the Varath are when they are with him. I submit this account because the official record contains 3 versions that are not accurate, and I believe accurate records are worth something even when nobody asks for them. And I believe that what happened in the lower market on that morning was not a security incident. It was something considerably simpler and considerably stranger than that. A man stood in a market and told the truth about what he was going to do, and 3 animals who had decided he was there stood with him, and the people who expected him to be small found out that he had, somewhere along the way, without intending to and without fully understanding it himself, become the thing that everything large and lethal in a 3-tier radius had chosen to stand next to. The Varath do not make errors of this kind. They read what is true about a creature, and they act on what they read, and they do not revise their conclusions without reason. They have not revised their conclusions about Soren Velk in 4 years. I do not think they will. I think the rest of us are still working out what they already know. Dovenseld Watch Officer retired, Calith Station.